Joining us now on the debate in Stanford, California, Catherine Stoner-Weiss, Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. In Washington, D.C., Matthew Rojansky, Deputy Director of the Russia and Eurasia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And with us here in studio, Sergei Plekhanov, Professor in the Political Science Department at York University, and Pyotr Dudkevich, Professor of Political Science at Carleton University. And it's a great pleasure, Sergei, to see you again. It's been a long time. Pyotr, nice to have you in the studio. And to our guests in Points Beyond. Get comfortable, everybody, because as is our custom here on Countries Week, we're going to do some maps, some fun facts to get us started with. Michael, if you would, let's bring these up, and here we go. Russia, as you know, is the largest country in the world. And there it is, Moscow, the capital, St. Petersburg, another one of the biggest cities. 17 million square kilometers. Population of almost 140 million people, 73% of whom live in urban centers. The population of Moscow alone, 10.5 million people, and St. Petersburg, 4.6 million. Gross domestic product in Russia, 2.223 trillion. GDP growth, 4% estimated in 2010. It is the second largest exporter of oil in the world. It is the largest exporter of natural gas in the world. And as you all know, we just had elections in Russia, and the first round for the parliamentary elections go like this. Taking place December 4th, 450 seats up for grabs. Vladimir Putin's party, United Russia, getting 238 seats based on almost half the votes cast. The Communist Party with just shy of 20% of the votes cast for 92 seats. Just Russia getting slightly more than 13% of the votes cast, good for 64 seats. And the Liberal Democrats at almost 12% of the votes cast, good for 56 seats. Let's find out how significant these numbers are. Sergei, United Russia, #1 on the ballot. Did they do as well as they wanted to?
It's a political defeat for the ruling party.
It's a defeat even though they came first.
It's a defeat for the ruling party. They expected to have, or at least they did have in the previous parliament, they did have a constitutional majority, meaning 2/3 of the seats. And now they barely squeaked in to have a slim majority, simple majority, 14 votes. And depending on how parliamentary politics will go in Russia, and that's a big question because the rules are going to change. I mean, the informal rules are going to change. On some votes, they may not be able to scramble together a majority.
Catherine, how would you interpret the results?
So I guess I don't see it as quite the dramatic change that your previous guest was saying. These are exactly the same four parties that have been in the parliament for the last 4 years. They've been pretty compliant with the executive authority. And I think it's important to remember also that the constitution that was passed by Mr. Putin's immediate predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, hastily in 1993 gives a tremendous amount of authority to the Russian president, not to the Duma. The Duma is relatively powerless. I think to the degree that this is a defeat, it's obviously a significant decrease in the number of seats that United Russia had before, it is I think it's a moral defeat more than it's actually a substantive defeat.
Pyotr.
Well, when I met Mr. Glizerov, who is the chair of the United Russia Party in November, they were planning to have about 300 seats. They are quite short of that. So from this perspective, they are short of the constitutional majority. In that sense, they did not fulfill the plan. On the other hand, they have majority. And in this sense, they've got what they wanted. So I believe that there is not a black and white picture. They are in the middle of the story.
Okay, Matthew, are you more do you think do you interpret these results as being more disappointing, or look, they still won?
Look, I think it's true they still maintain control, but the reason that they maintain control isn't about the Duma election results. It's about other numbers, like Vladimir Putin's personal popularity, which is still 60–70%, according to polls. You know, even if it's plummeted, let's say it's fallen by 10 or 20%, he's still head and shoulders the most popular man in the country, and as long as he's willing to lend his authority and his personal stature to the United Russia Party, it's not a sure thing, but as long as he's willing to do that, I think the party's fine. I think the Putin system, by and large, and here I would agree with Catherine, you know, I think it's not about to go away anytime soon.
Did they cheat, Sergei?
Well, it looks like they did. The question is to what degree. Among Russian so-called political technologists, it is assumed that the cheating is usually within the range of 5 to 6%. Even if this time it was in that range, it is quite possible that without cheating, the United Russia Party might not have gained a majority. But it is admitted by the top leaders that some violations did take place across Russia.
But not
the question is how many.
Right.
What was special about this election was an army of independent observers mounted primarily or mobilized primarily by opposition parties and the communists. And by the way, regarding the communists as just Putin's patsies, I think is a misreading of Russian politics. And they have been part of the parliament for quite a while. They've been the main opposition party in Russia. The fact that they're not, Western-type liberals does not negate the fact that they are an opposition party, and on a lot of issues, including, by the way, democracy, civil liberties, economic, social policies, inequality, and so on, they have been very strong critics and opponents of the ruling party from the left.
And will be again, I guess. Pyotr, you were shaking your head when Sergei was talking about the cheating.
Yes, because many irregularities were reported, but so far the observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, they said that more or less everything is fine. Other observers, international observers, including EU, they were also saying that with irregularities in place, still this is a valid vote, and also no one from the officially registered parties complain officially about the elections.
Catherine, how alarmed should we be about this vote?
Okay, so I would have to contradict Pyotr. That's actually not true about the OSCE. They published a report on Monday or Tuesday of this week indicating that, in fact, it was not free and fair. And the Communist Party has already announced that they're considering challenging the results in court. So I think that's a misreading of how the elections have been viewed. There's some I think what got a lot of people out on the streets last weekend was that there were some pretty blatant cases of fraud, if you can believe the videos that you're seeing of election officials actually getting in ballot boxes to spread out bundles of ballots that had been filled out in favor of United Russia. So a considerable amount of cheating, maybe as much as 20% are some of the more dramatic numbers that have been reported. I have no idea whether those are accurate.
Matthew, let me find out from Matthew first. Do you have a sense, first of all, Matthew, about how much cheating went on? And if you do, would it have been enough to change those numbers we showed earlier significantly?
Well, if it was 20%, then yes, absolutely, it would have changed the numbers significantly. Although, by the way, when you spread out that 20% among the other opposition parties, 3 or 4, depending on whether they would have crossed the 5 or 6 or 7% threshold to get into the Duma in the first place, United Russia still probably would have had a plurality. Let's remember, tens of millions of Russians, however you cut the cake, did come out and vote for the United Russia Party. But I just have to point out here, I think if we confine ourselves to analyzing whether election day went freely and fairly as somehow judging the system as then being legitimate, I think you're making a huge mistake. I've participated in OSCE observer missions before. There's a reason that they send long-term observers, and that when they issue their final statement, it's not just about was there cheating in terms of the number of ballots in the boxes and so on election day. It's about was the entire atmosphere and environment in which the contest took place free and fair. And I think their clear answer in Russia was it wasn't.
Sergei, is that a fair point, that the lead up to it was also
unfree? Well, at least
unfree?
this is a widespread perception among the Russians. Prior to the election, one of the leading opinion polls asked Russians about whether they expected that the ruling party would be using all kinds of special methods in order to inflate its numbers at the polls. And more than half of them expected that at different levels this would be done. And it's not just the videos. Now there's a stream of data coming from all kinds of observers, eyewitness reports, news stories, and so on and so forth, as well as some lawsuits which are already being filed, indicating that, yes, election fraud did take place on a large scale. Whether that invalidates the election or not is an interesting political issue. And I think that the answer to that question will be given in the coming weeks, because there is quite a movement in Russia in favor of holding another election. Mikhail Gorbachev, the former president of the Soviet Union, publicly called for a new election.
That's pretty extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's pretty extraordinary.
Yeah. Catherine, let me ask
I
you
don't
not
think
just...
that's going to have any effect, though.
You don't think Gorbachev will be influential in that?
He's very popular here in the United States and perhaps in Canada as well, but he's not popular in his own country. And he ran for president of Russia in 1996 and got less than 1% of the vote. So I think, you know, he has some moral authority, perhaps, but not as much as you might think.
What matters is not Gorbachev. What matters is not Gorbachev. What matters is that there are large numbers of people who are increasingly involved in the political process, demanding that something be done about that fraud. It has become a major political issue in Russia, and it is mobilizing people. It's just it's happening as we speak.
Catherine, let me ask you about not just the four parties that we do see in that parliament, but about what we don't see. Because as Matthew pointed out, you do have to get 7% floor vote in order to get representation there. So what's missing from that picture that might have been there had the floor been lower?
So what's missing is are a number of sort of more liberal parties, but also actually some more so-called patriotic parties or nationalistic parties. And then there are those that were not allowed to register at all. And it's several of those smaller groups that are actually leading the protests, in particular a movement called Solidarity that was not permitted to register, that was central to getting the 30 to 50,000 protesters out on the streets in Moscow on earlier last weekend.
100,000, by the way, 100,000.
Well, there's discrepancies about
well,
how many
No,
people.
was
that's the
100,000.
accurate
Yeah,
count. The total number that took part was 100,000. 50,000 was the max at a given moment. But
Well,
people were coming and going.
I would believe 100,000. I would believe 100,000 across Russia. I wouldn't believe 100,000 in Moscow. You can see the
Well,
overhead
you can
photos they
believe-
took from
that.
helicopters.
Well, that's what
Yeah, not
observers
seen
have
that
written.
number.
Well,
but
you know what?
perhaps.
We actually have some pictures of this, so with the permission of our director, let's bring some of those shots up. And Piotr, maybe I can get you to start. When you saw these pictures, when you saw the images on television, what did you think?
Mutiny of the emerging middle class. Young, I believe quite educated, very outspoken, well-dressed, means with some money, and protesting against something they do not have, rule of law and political choice.
What influence do you think these protests can have?
Quite large, because this is the game change right now. Since the middle class is becoming politicized, it will be much more stable than very fragmented, so far, opposition movement in Russia. So we see the beginning of something quite stable, quite large, and very persistent.
We saw, Matthew, an Arab Spring earlier this year. Are we seeing a Moscow Spring now?
Yeah, look, I really have to take issue with this notion that across the board the middle class is becoming politicized. First of all, assume even 100,000, assume 200,000, right? This represents a relatively fringe constituency just in terms of the numbers. Now, I don't disagree with the notion that there were people participating in this rally, and I've talked to some of them, who haven't been participating in politics before, who come from the middle class. In some sense, they're people who shared the wealth of the Putin boom of the last decade, and that's a very new phenomenon. But this doesn't mean that the middle classes, right, 1 million plus Russians in Moscow and St. Petersburg, Vladivostok, other big cities all across the Russian Federation, are somehow now politically mobilized, and more than that they are politically liberal and that they're opposed to the regime. I don't think it says any of those things. These are still people who, given the binary choice, go home, enjoy my nicely renovated apartment, my car that I have, my opportunity to vacation abroad, to save money abroad, to educate my children, all things that they've had that they didn't have in the 1990s, versus attack the Putin system and try and bring it down. I think their goals are much more modest than that. A recount of the last election doesn't somehow undermine the entire system, and I don't think the middle class wants to see that.
Catherine, when you saw the pictures, what went through your mind?
It reminded me a lot of the mobilization of the early 1990s, and I guess I would back up a lot of what Matthew has to say. I mean, that fizzled. Unfortunately, you know, and I've written this in a couple of places this week in Foreign Affairs in the New York Times earlier. I don't see this as an Arab Spring kind of situation, or even an Orange Revolution, the likes of which we had in Ukraine in 2004. I mean, the plan here is only to get back out on the streets on December 24th. The election results have already been ratified by the Central Electoral Commission. To the extent that that matters, I think it actually does matter. And the Duma is going to sit, this new Duma is going to sit December 21st. So we don't have a united opposition. We still have a fragmented opposition. And there's no obvious leader who's going to come out as the opposition candidate to actually challenge Putin in the much more important presidential elections that are upcoming in March of 2012.
Sergei, I've left you for the end because, of course, you're the only one of our guests today who was born in that city, and I want to know what you thought when you saw those pictures.
Oh, I was thinking of August 1991. I participated in that outpouring, and nobody expected that there would be 100,000 people protecting the White House from the coup launched by the hardliners who deposed Gorbachev and so on and so forth. The numbers matter, 100,000, even if it's 50,000, but it was 100.
But it worked
Right.
20 years ago.
Yes.
Do you think it can work today?
Well, listen, we baby boomers made that revolution. It's time for the next generation, for our children, to do their bit. Russia is off the stagnant point at which it was for quite a while. It wasn't total stagnation, lots of economic progress, but so many examples of significant political change are driven not by economic crisis, but by economic progress, when people who are no longer hungry and are a little bit better off begin to demand other things, such as rule of law, justice, competitive election, more freedom, and so on and so forth. This is what's happening. I think Russia listen, Time magazine has just named Man of the Year for this year, and it's the protester. Right? Mm-hmm. It started almost exactly a year ago with a fruit dweller, Mr. Bouazizi, in Tunisia, who burned himself in protest against the regime. And at the end of the year, how could Russia stay aside? So this bug of protest, of demanding your rights, doing it peacefully. Nobody is burning themselves in Russia. They can gather peacefully, they can demonstrate, and they will stick with it, you know?
Okay, but Pyotr, let me put this to you, because Pew Research just published a very substantial poll of Russians that shows that 20 years after the fall of the USSR, just 50% approved of the switch to multi-party democracy. Does that make sense to you?
Yes, because this is the influence of the early 1990s, where democracy introduced by Yeltsin for most of the people meant nothing. Democracy in Russia was commodified. You could have buy and sell democracy on the electoral market for almost 20 years. You could have bought the whole parliament without a problem from the fraction of the money the oligarchs have. So, in other words, democracy in Russia was very much against the notion of fairness and justice.
And that's why that 50% number is not higher.
Exactly.
Matthew, let me try this with you. Do opposition parties, do any of them, offer any real democratic alternatives to Vladimir Putin at the moment?
I think the problem right now is that whereas members of the middle class might previously have refused to talk about politics, they say, what's the point? We don't have any choices. Now they'll have the conversation with you. They've had it with me. And they'll talk about how frustrated they are, how they don't like the corruption, how they don't like the opacity of the system, they don't like the abuses. But the conversation still ends with, what's the point? There's nothing we can do about it. Not, let's pour into the streets and let's bring down the system. This is not a 1991 moment in that sense, and it's not an Arab Spring. I think it's partly because there isn't any unifying leadership. I think if you look at, we were talking earlier about the parties that weren't allowed to be registered. Well, a lot of the people representing those parties have had their shot. These were people who had high office in the 1990s, and they're associated with the exact kind of corruption and buying and selling of democracy and real chaos, banditry even, I think is the word that Putin likes to use. And the middle classes, by and large, agree with him in that. They're not interested in opening up a new era of chaos like the 1990s. Would they like to see gradual change? Yes. Would they be happy with a recount of the election and a reduction of United Russia's dominance in the Duma? Yes, they'd be happy with that. Does this, in the end, though, translate to bringing down Vladimir Putin come March's presidential election? Certainly without a viable alternative who represents stable and gradual progress for the good, I just can't foresee that.
Sergei, you want to take that on?
Well, I'm just amazed at how negative our American friends are. I mean, I could cite all those things, but they're looking at just one side of the picture, and they're totally missing the fact that Russia has awakened. And the fact that, of course, you cannot talk about the middle class. You can never talk about the whole society, right? When you just talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union, was that done by 300 million people or even 50 million or even 10 million people? Of course not. We're talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5%, the more active citizens and their willingness to stick for their democratic rights. Also, another point is, why do we should use the yardstick? Will they overthrow the Putin system? Or will they defeat Putin at the polls? There are many other things that they can do short of that. They can push Putin, even if Putin is reelected, which is not guaranteed at this point, by the way. Even if
March,
Putin, for all those things that were mentioned, and I see them all, I agree with all those points, but that's only part of the picture. Even if Putin is reelected, that will be a very different presidency from the one that we saw in the beginning of the last
Let me ask
decade.
Catherine, because I want to give our American friends, as you've called them, an opportunity to reevaluate if they feel they want to. Catherine, anything Sergei said that make you want to change your mind?
So I would point out that I'm a dual citizen, actually. I'm a Canadian and an American.
Okay.
So perhaps that gives me the right to be slightly schizophrenic on this. Then I would agree with both sides of the Sergei and Matthew have both made valid points. I guess I lean a little bit more toward Matthew. I don't see this as an Arab Spring, but to say Russia has awakened, I don't think the Russian people were ever really asleep, frankly. But I do think, if you look at the Pew poll, which is, you had mentioned it, Steve, earlier, if you look at the Pew poll, you'll see that what people value is still, their pocketbooks, so their pocketbook voting. Well, Russia went through a very rough time, as have we all, between 2008 and the present, with the global economic crisis. You quoted their growth at the beginning as last year as 4% GDP. It was, 8% GDP year on year between 2000 and 2008. So people have become accustomed to their personal incomes growing by multiples. And now they're not. And on top of that, they feel that their votes may have been stolen. And I think in particular, the protest is about Putin's announcement that he was coming back without really consulting anyone. And, I think, as I said, I was slightly schizophrenic on this. On the one hand, people think, what can I do? And all they can do is come out on the streets. But I think the regime has learned. I think, they're still learning. I think the fact that nobody was arrested last weekend when these protests took place is significant. There's no violence going on. But I don't think, given that nobody's sitting in Red Square, if you will, or Bolotnaya Square, all this week, threatening to turn over the government, it shows you this is not an Arab Spring situation.
Well, hang on. Okay,
hang on. That's the Russian winter. That's not an Arab Spring.
I understand, but Matthew also needs to hear from Pyotr, and then he gets a chance to respond to why he's got this so wrong. Okay, Sergei, stand by.
No, it was very characteristic that immediately after the elections, the main manipulator of the Russian political system, Władysław Surkov, came and gave the interview to the TV saying that in Russia the Liberal Party is very much needed, the party of the center. The problem is right now whether or not this party, like most of the Russian parties, will be completely fabricated, manipulated, and built from the scratch by the political will, or this party will be built from the ground. And that's the difference that this 40, 50, or 60,000 people in Bolotnaya Square made. That is the difference.
100,000.
Okay, Sergei, 120,000 for you.
All right, thank you.
But the idea is that now the elite cannot ignore these thousands of people. And that's the chance that the political system will be slowly moving, reforming, but including more independent components of this.
Okay, let me give Matthew equal time here now that he's had the benefit of hearing the 2 Canadians and 2.5 Canadians, I guess, express their wisdom on this. Go ahead, Matthew.
Well, just outnumbered as I am in terms of citizenship here, it would be foolhardy of me to fight on. But no, look, what I grant to Sergei specifically is I actually think this is about changing what Putin represents, but in effect leaving Putin be, because I don't think that there are other alternatives, as I said earlier. That could change, right? If there's a dramatically different face, Prokhorov, the billionaire playboy, he's entered the race. Kudrin, has sort of intimated, this is the former finance minister, that he might. So let's be concrete. For the moment, there are no alternatives that I think sensible Russians, this constituency that you were talking about, sort of building a party from the ground up, well, that's fine. But if you talk about a presidential system, as Catherine pointed out, it's got to have a face at the top of it. It's got to have an individual who holds it together. That's always been true in Russia. Sort of disorganized pluralism, that reminds people of the 1990s, and they know that it doesn't work. But in reality, I think what Russians are going to be looking for is a few key concessions from Putin. Maybe it means some kind of recount or reshuffling. It definitely means more transparency so that they feel that when they make a choice, when they announce that choice publicly, be it on Facebook or be it at the polls, that they get some result that's meaningful. I think the other thing they're going to be looking for is fresh faces. And Putin can do that without removing himself. Yes, there's been a lot of talk about what if he stays on, a 6-year presidential term plus another 6-year presidential term. It's like he's been there forever. He's going to start looking like Brezhnev. That's true, but Brezhnev also surrounded himself by old men in uniforms. Putin can surround himself with young, dynamic people. He's tried to do it with Medvedev. It's become a bit of a joke, but there are others in the system, and if he's smart, I think he'll respond by doing that now.
Sergei.
Well, exactly. That's what I was going to say, that Putin, if he's elected for the next term, will be facing very different expectations from the Russian society. Because when he came to power in the year 2000, last days of 1999, he was expected to introduce order in Russia. There was a massive demand for organizing Russia better, restoring the state. Control was the watchword. And in that sense, his presidency, his authoritarian presidency, was consonant with the expectations of the public and the elites. Let's not forget, the elites were very, very fearful about the possibility that they might lose what they had gained in the 1990s. And that meant wealth, that made power, a lot of other things. Now, and we have just witnessed that in Russia, all across Russia, people want more democracy, they want more accountability, they want more transparency in government, they want fresh faces. And Putin will need to show, and that's the only way he will be elected, that he gets that. Okay. And it's possible that he will be able to do so. Then he will be elected and govern successfully.
Catherine, you wanted in.
Yep. Yeah, I was going to say, actually, just following up on the earlier points about, who's going to suffer the most from these election results. Well, Medvedev, I think, is actually suffering. Medvedev's name was at the top of the United Russia list. In fact, it was the only name on the United Russia list, and he was expected to get 55% of the vote, and he didn't. So, when you think about what might happen and who might get sacrificed and how can Putin show he's listening, well, he might be able to show he's listening by exactly shuffling the team he has behind him and actually shuffling Medvedev out. Medvedev's supposed to become prime minister, and Putin sort of qualified that a week and a half ago by saying if United Russia does well. Well, United Russia didn't do as well. We're starting to see a few regional actors being sacrificed because they either didn't produce the vote or they were blatantly fraudulent in producing the votes for United Russia. And I think we might see Medvedev actually not become prime minister or become a very short-lived prime minister and perhaps a replacement in the form of someone like Kudrin, which would also disarm any potential opposition Putin may face, meaningful opposition.
So far, there is no match for Putin in the presidential election. So Prokhorov is no match. He compromised himself by participating and forming the Right Cause Party, from which he withdrew after a few months before elections. So now he is saying...
The Russian people hate the oligarchs, right? He is not emblematic of freedom in Russia.
Yeah, but they love basketball, and he owns an NBA team.
But not a Russian team.
They don't care.
New Jersey. What do they care about New Jersey?
So the point is
that's more important to New Jersey.
Yeah, so the point is that Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin is safe for the presidential election. But when we met him in November, a group of...
Just explain that. You had a meeting with Putin a month ago.
There is a group of 30-plus people, so-called Valdai Club. We are usually invited to discuss Russian politics every year.
And this was a private meeting with him?
And it was a private meeting with him. And one of the questions was, what will be the difference between Putin 1 and Putin 2? And he sort of bypassed the answer by making a few jokes. But then he said, look, I understand that the system doesn't work. For the first time, he admitted this to the group of journalists. I know that the system doesn't work. And then he said, we should reform the system slowly and put a new faces. So probably Matthew is right. The new faces and some adjustment will be the maximum what we can expect.
I don't think that faces can do it. I mean, you need institutional changes. I mean, faces, who's talking about faces?
Well, do you get institutional change when you get new people in place?
Well, or the other way around.
No, I don't think so.
No?
Yeah.
Catherine, it goes the other
what
way?
institutional changes are you going to make? Why would he, he could get rid of United Russia completely. It would make no difference. There, in the 1990s, there was a ruling party that went by a different name. So it's not the institution of United Russia that is problematic. It is a hollow institution.
How about the independence of the courts?
Well, it'd be nice to see, but I don't think
No, but
we're
that's
seeing
institutional change that people want.
Matthew, I see you're trying to get in.
Let me make 2 points here. The first is about Putin himself. I mean, to the extent that we are talking about what Vladimir Putin wants, what he's able to do, whether he understands Putin 1.0 versus 2.0, is he getting old, all these things, we're acknowledging the fact that this is a Putin-dominated system. It is still Putinism in Russia, and it's likely to remain Putinism. And so I think we need to understand his motivations and what he wants. I think of that like a bell curve. At the low end of the bell curve in the beginning, he was after personal gain. I think he wanted to protect himself. I think he wanted to build his circle, build his influence, perhaps some personal wealth. He got that. And as he built to then the peak of the bell curve, I think his ambition for the country, and this is, you could call it noble, but it's certainly nationalistic, I think that took over. And here you get the Eurasian Union ambitions and Russia as a great power in the 2007 Munich speech. Even the reset works into this. But I think now he's on the other end of this bell curve. As he feels threatened, I think he has to start protecting himself once again. Because in a sense, if he loses a little bit and if he falls down that slippery slope, all bets are off, and even the basic things that he won for himself, wealth, personal security, protection for his family circle, he's been very good, by the way, at protecting his family through all of this, all those bets are off. And so I think it's a struggle for survival for Putin personally.
So what do
the
you
second
expect him
point
to
I would
do?
just make quickly is, I expect him to protect himself with all the tools he has at his disposal. That's why, by the way, I mean, I think it was Catherine pointed out very rightly, they haven't used violence. They haven't attacked the protesters. There haven't been mass arrests. There have been some arrests. I think he's being very judicious in the use of force, but he still wants to maintain control. But let me make a second point very quickly, and that is, I think we can't stand back from this system like somehow we're sort of master architects of the political universe and construct it in an ideal form. What would be the thing that would enable the system to last forever? This is like evolution. It builds on what already exists. And so you can't say you're just going to have a clean, transparent judiciary. You have the judiciary that you have. You have judges sitting there who've been there for, a decade now if they're Putin appointees. You've got to work with what you have. And I think the middle class's demands reflect that, or the participants in this protest movements, they are gradualistic demands.
Well, let's ask this, Catherine, as to whether or not we think the Russian people are at the point now where they want to see an end to the, to the czar. Have they had enough of authoritarian leaders? What do you think?
I don't think so. I think what they want is stability and prosperity, and again, that comes through in the Pew poll that was done in April of this year. I think that's still the case. They're still coming through saying, that they're hesitant to back an unfair multi-party system. But if the rules are written down, then they would like the rules followed. But they want enforcement they're also saying by a strong hand. But they're not saying they want theft. So, I think public opinion is very complicated, and it also changes very quickly. So unfortunately, I think this is very important in terms of providing Mr. Putin with information. But I think he has enough room to actually meet some of the protesters' demands. The protesters are not on the street today, and I think this will sort of fit.
Whoops, it looks like we had a little satellite fall out there. We're going to try and reconnect Catherine so she can make her finish off her point there. We just lost satellite feed. Have we got you back, Catherine? Catherine, just finish up the point.
Yep,
I think we just had a little wink out, but you're back.
I'm not sure where you lost me exactly, but
literally 10 seconds ago.
Okay, I was just saying that that you know I think these protests have given the regime some information, and Mr. Putin has enough room to adjust his stance before March, and again make it look like he is trying to meet some of those demands. But I think if we're looking for a complete overhaul of the system as a result of 50 or even 100 or 200,000 protesters on the streets in a country of almost 140 million people, that's just not going to do it. We need a consolidated
also not
opposition.
even possible.
2.5 minutes to go. Sergey.
Of course it's a process. Of course it's a process, and nobody's expecting a total overhaul of the system in response to one rally. But, Catherine, don't forget, 2 weeks after this big rally, there'll be another one on the 24th. There'll be another one in downtown
But we've already got a
Moscow.
Duma sitting the 21st. So
It doesn't matter.
And that's great. And a lot of the people in this square are friends of mine, and I've known for 20 years, and I wish them all the best. And I'm sick with worry when they go out there. But
well, that's good. But you mentioned that the protesters are gone. They're not gone. They're convening back. On Monday, the Communist Party is having its protest rally, and that's also important, and so on. But my point is that, in fact, when we talk about the Russians or Russia, let's not forget that it's a huge and very diverse country.
Of course.
And there is a big division between the more conservative people who are unsure of change, afraid of change, who value whatever material comfort they have, or struggling with poverty, and so on and so forth. They live in the rural areas, they live in small towns and so on. They're more conservative, more likely to vote for the ruling party. And then there are big urban centers where you have greater concentration of upwardly moving middle class, people with different expectations, new generation coming into the fray, demanding change, not being afraid to press for it. So let's not forget that this is always, if Putin only responds to the conservatives, I think that will be very short-sighted.
Let me give the last 30 seconds to Piotr on whether he thinks the death of the Tsar is with us.
Not yet, not yet. But the notion of the stability and prosperity is changing. It will be no stability and prosperity without the political change and without the certain concession to particularly urban middle class. And this middle class is growing from 28 to 40% in about 30 years from now. So, and these people demand not only freedom of movement, speech and so on, they demand the security of the property, which means new legal system and enforcing of the laws, means new political parties, means new ways of political expression and new representation. That's what they want, and they will get it.
We'll keep watching. I want to thank everybody for participating in Night 4 of Countries Week here on TVO. Catherine Stoner-Weiss at Stanford University, Matthew Rojansky in our Washington studios, Sergey Plekhanov from York University, Piotr Dudkiewicz, Carleton University. Appreciate your time, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.